One day John Ashworth found a miserable-looking woman asleep in a dry ditch near a place called Woodgate. The woman's name was Kate. She was about 30 years old and was in a poor state because of drinking and crime. Kate had come from Todmorden to Rochdale and was heading towards Bolton. She felt blessed by Mr. Ashworth's kindness in allowing her to walk with him. John Ashworth's first volume of Strange Tales was first published in 1863. He wrote, "The reader may rest assured that these tales are true, as hundreds in Rochdale and the neighbourhood can testify. And perhaps nowhere are they so popular as in this locality, because they are known to be narratives of fact. I am a tradesman, and make no pretension to literary ability. If he whom I desire to serve condescends to use me as a medium of good to others, my most earnest wish will be realised." The first volume of Strange Tales included the tale of Ellen Bland, who had died in the workhouse, the Johnson family in the cellar on Cheetham Street, the two old men, Lawrence and Pinder, Sanderson and little Alice, Wilkins, old Richard and his daughter Alice, who drowned, and Joseph Sutcliffe, who was buried in the silent corner, as well as narratives about his mother, Niff Kershaw, and one about the opening of the chapel for the destitute, entitled My New Friends. In 1863, John Ashworth's daughter, Mary Jane, married Mr. Amos Barraclough. In his diary, Mr. Ashworth wrote, "This day is a day of days. My dear daughter married to Amos Barraclough. My heart feels more than I can express. The Lord bless them." The immense and increasing circulation of his strange tales brought an amount of popularity which John Ashworth found rather inconvenient, and often irksome. His diaries show that at times his temper was ruffled, and he experienced a great depression of spirit. One evening, on returning from Manchester, he wrote, "A very full meeting, returned home through wet and cold at 11 o'clock. I find it a heavy tax to be a little popular." Another time he said, "Returned from Preston this morning, found many letters waiting, requesting me to go to other places. Lord guide me in these things. I wish to do all I can, but find it hard work." Mr. Ashworth also said, "I find that except I look well to my God and my own heart, these ovations will rob me of my humility and peace. The fuss and ovations I have from day to day, especially in the towns I visit, will ruin my peace with God. Lord, help me to give all the glory to Thee." A second series of John Ashworth's Strange Tales was published in 1865. At this time Mr. Ashworth also opened a school for poor children at Brickfield in the village of Smallbridge. The chapel for the destitute received many monetary donations which were used to help the poor. In 1865 Mr. Ashworth used £6, 1 shilling and sixpence of the money given to purchase a waterbed for a young woman named Naomi Taylor, who had been confined to her sickbed for 9 years. Naomi was a mill worker from Hooley Bridge near Haywood, and was at one time a healthy, cheerful, active labourer, and sang hymns amidst the rumbling and rattle of machinery. But when she was about 16 years old she had developed a spinal weakness, and was unable to walk the short distance from her home to the mill. Ultimately she became so helpless that she was forced to remain continually in bed. Naomi had some relief from the weary hours in being able to refresh her mind with the pleasures of reading. She derived much pleasure from reading her Bible and other books. But after 3 years, intense pains in her head began to seriously affect her eyes. These pains were followed by dimness, darkness, and at last by utter blindness. However, Naomi continued to have faith in the love of Christ, believing that all things work together for good to them that love God. John Ashworth said Naomi wept for joy when she was first placed on the new waterbed, and it was to her an unspeakable boon. He said of Naomi, "Her case is a sad one indeed, poor, sick, and blind, but she enjoys a peace which neither poverty, sickness, nor blindness can take away." In addition to conducting services in Rochdale and the villages in the neighbourhood, Mr. Ashworth had preaching engagements all across the country. In his diary he wrote, "Painting, preaching, lecturing, writing, and travelling hundreds of miles weekly keep me very busy. Hope to have a little rest." Very often he had 3 services on the Sabbath and 2 on the weekday, but even though he was away from home so much, he was still diligent in business at the shop he had on Drake Street. A commercial traveller who was staying at a temperance hotel opposite his paint shop enquired of the hostess if she knew such a man as John Ashworth, and after assuring him she did, he remarked, "I suppose he's one of those men that go up and down preaching, praying, and neglecting his business." To which she replied, "Do you see that shop over there?" pointing to the place. "Yes," he said. "Well then, every morning at 5:45 you will see John Ashworth there, sending his men to their work." In order to do this, Mr. Ashworth returned from his engagements the same evening, though it was often near midnight, and sometimes after, before he reached home. Yet he was at his place in the morning. John Ashworth's daughter, Mary Jane, and her husband, Amos Barraclough, had a daughter, Ada, and a son, John Ashworth Barraclough, Mr. Ashworth's grandchildren. On the 3rd of February 1866, a young woman called Sarah came to Mr. Ashworth's door in rags, with a black eye. Sarah had once loved and served God well, but had married a man called Stephen against godly advice, and ended up in an abusive relationship with a cruel, idle, drunken husband. After moving to Rochdale with their 2 boys, Sarah and Stephen started going to the chapel for the destitute. Stephen also started working as a hawker, selling cockles and mussels, but his drinking and violence continued. Stephen once even threatened to chop Sarah's head off. On one occasion, Sarah lost reason in the dead of night, leapt out of bed and ran down the Foundry Brow to the end of Water Street, in nothing but a nightdress, where she stood still, looked up at the full moon and started singing, waking up her neighbours who looked out on the strange, astonishing scene. In reference to Sarah's sorry tale, Mr. Ashworth wrote, "Oh, what havoc being unequally yoked has made, what wretched homes, what blighted hopes, what broken hearts, what early graves." The 18th of February 1866 was the golden wedding celebration of James and Peggy Horrocks. James and Peggy lived in one of a long row of neat cottages overlooking the valley in which flowed the River Roach, near a large mill at Hooley Bridge, which was built by Mr. Fenton of Bamford Hall. The long row in which they lived was probably one now called Pleasant Street at Hooley Bridge. John Ashworth says his business often led him past the door of James and Peggy's cottage, and he became acquainted with them, saying, "The minister of the gospel had in them charitable hearers and affectionate counsellors," and that few entered their cottage without a word about spiritual things. Many times when he called, after the first expression of welcome, Peggy would say, "Let us talk a little about spiritual things first, for they ought to be first, and then we will talk about business and trade after." Mr. Ashworth said, "In this village home we have a pleasing illustration of love in a cottage. I have often sat at their humble fireside, exchanging and comparing religious experience with James and Peggy, and have come away a better and more thoughtful man, and believe that hundreds have done the same. The poor, the sick, and the dying often found them as angels of mercy. The erring one found sympathy, the doubting one encouragement, and the young believer in Christ was strengthened with wise advice." At their golden wedding celebration, James Horrocks commented on his and Peggy's 50 years of marriage, saying, "It is all of God's goodness and mercy. We are both monuments of his mercies, and subjects of his saving grace." In 1866, a young lad called James Burrows murdered a family man called John Brennan in the stables near the Hopwood Arms pub at Slattox, so he could steal his money. 13 weeks later, on the 24th of August 1866, John Ashworth visited 18-year-old Burrows at the New Bailey in Salford, the day before he was executed for the crime which became known as the Slattox murder. James Burrows asked Mr. Ashworth to visit him before the execution, requesting that he go on to speak to young men and warn them against keeping bad company as he had done. Burrows remembered how Mr. Ashworth had often spoken to young men, including himself, near Thornham Lane on the road from Rochdale to Middleton, about the dangers of keeping bad company, and described how he wished he had heeded that warning. Mr. Ashworth prayed and sobbed with the poor repentant young lad, whose execution in Salford was watched by a crowd of 20,000 people, and promised to carry out his wish to the best of his ability, quoting Proverbs 13 verse 20, which says, He that walketh with wise men shall be wise, but a companion of fools shall be destroyed. A young man called William Berry was looking forward to James Burrows' execution. He said to one of his fellow workmen, "I will work overtime today, for I am going to see Burrows hanged on Saturday." But in 6 hours William Berry was himself dead. Immediately after he had spoken the words, he fell from the top of a building in Bamford, and was killed on the spot. John Ashworth said, "He went to his account before the man he was going to see executed." So uncertain is human life, and no man is wise who is not prepared for this uncertainty. William Berry's death was reported in the Bury Times on Saturday the 25th of August, 1866. The news report said, "Fatal accident. On Tuesday evening a labourer named William Berry was killed at Dixon Fold near Bamford. Deceased on the day in question was labouring for a number of bricklayers who were employed on the erection of a new mill at Dixon Fold for Mr. J. Porritt, Crimble Hall. The scaffolding on which he stood fell a little before 5 o'clock in the evening from a height of 50 foot or 60 foot, and deceased was so injured that he died soon afterwards." 31-year-old William Berry was buried at St. James's Church, Ashworth, on the 25th of August, 1866. John Ashworth knew an aged couple called John and Mary Howarth, who started attending the chapel for the destitute in their later years. They admitted to living like pigs before doing so. Mary was wandering about in the streets one Sunday evening and saw a card inviting poor people to the chapel. When she went in and saw so many poor people singing praises to God, she began to cry. She persuaded her husband John to go along too. John and Mary subsequently began to pray together in their humble cellar on Falinge Road, and started to have a weekly prayer meeting there. On the 12th of December 1866, 300 men and boys were killed in an explosion at Oaks Colliery in Barnsley. John Ashworth visited the scene the following week. He wrote a narrative about the incident, which he entitled "A Sad Story." In 1867, John Ashworth was affected much by the simple prayers of a poor man called John Stott, who he visited at his home. 90-year-old John Stott was lodging in a house at Top of Moulding in Birtle. John Stott had been joined to the Church of his Saviour for 70 years after being converted at the age of 20, and had lived for 20 years as a widower. Mr. Ashworth said, "What a testimony! Only 5 shillings per week, living in lodgings, 90 years of age, and in his own opinion the happiest old felly out of heaven."